Sorry to interrupt. Sounds like you're all having fascinating conversations, but we do need to get underway. Well, welcome one and all here this evening to the TUC for what we hope to be a very informative and enlightening evening, talking about Cuba Under Siege and some aspects of that. We have with us some very distinguished guests who I'll briefly introduce, but we'll have the opportunity to share more about later on. So to my right, we have His Excellency, the Ambassador of Cuba to New Zealand, and he's got a half a dozen names, but he said I'm to introduce him as Luis Rodríguez, so that Luis is fine. And we have also Dr. David Small from the University of Canterbury, and also with us tonight is Ian Powell, who many of you may know from his media presence. I'll talk a little more about that later on. And also we have Dr. Josephine Varghese from University of Canterbury also. My name is Dr. Nathan McCluskey, and although I am a doctor, I'm not going to be addressing you on any particular subject of expertise this evening. So you can rest assured there's only 4 speakers, not 5, but we will have a Q&A session after the speakers. And in between each speaker, there'll be a 5-minute break for you to catch your breath and summarise your notes if you're taking any and so on. By way of housekeeping, there are 2 exits, one here and one out here, and just behind the stairs there. So if we need to evacuate the building, please do so through those doors and in an orderly fashion. No punching and pushing on the way out. And we gather somewhere near car park 43, I'm told, which is close to the fence over the back of the car park. Toilets are just through this door here and to the right. Now, on the left-hand side, my left-hand side, but on your right-hand side as you came in the door, just on the inside there is a box for donations. So for those who are able to and would like to contribute to the cause of NZDE, New Zealanders for a Democratic Economy, who are putting this event on this evening to further the awareness in the community of a democratic economy and democratic economics, which is really what this evening is all about, because in Cuba, they've managed to do that. And unfortunately, in doing so, they've managed to put the Americans offside because they don't like a challenge to their economic system, which is very different, as you're probably well aware. So we're going to hear some more about that this evening. But I think that's probably all we need by way of introductions. Lovely to have you here, and I hope you find it informative and you generate some good questions that you can contribute to in the Q&A. So first of all, we'll be hearing from Ian Powell. Now, Ian, for over 30 years, was the Executive Director of the Association of Medical Salaried Specialists, or the AMSS, sorry, yes. I have to get that right, because earlier this evening I was thinking, I thought it was just the Association of Salaried Specialists, and I thought that's not a very good acronym. So I'm glad, good. I'm glad that Ian put me right on that. Ian is also, since stepping down from that role in 2019, he has become reasonably well known in the media. He's got a couple of blogs. One is Ōtautahi. Second Opinion, that's it, right, yeah. And the other one also is Political Bites. And there was an interesting article on that just recently with Simeon Brown, crossing the bridge of the bridge of broken dreams, from what I understand, and he's broken many dreams. So with that background, Ian can talk to us from a very experienced position with those who are quite critically involved in the medical profession. And so I'd like you to put your hands together and give a warm welcome to Ian Powell.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the honour as well. I've spoken at many meetings over, I hope I can be heard on this, it's many meetings over the years, but the first time ever that I've been a warm-up act for an ambassador. Never happened before, but if I was going to be a warm-up act for an ambassador, I couldn't think of a better country to do it for in the case of Cuba, particularly in the current circumstances. Now, contrary to, there's been a common misunderstanding that I'm a doctor, and I've had to, in many occasions, had to sort of make not much talking to our union members, but elsewhere, to make the point that I'm not. And I invariably say, look, if anybody carks it here, don't come to me. Recently, I was giving a presentation in Waikanae on the Kapiti coast, and what happened was that I gave this little thing, and somebody soon after nearly did and had to be taken away. So I've got to moderate that line somewhat, just in case by saying it I generate someone nearly carking it, but hopefully not tonight. I lived in Christchurch for about 6 years in the mid to late 70s. 2 of those were as a taxi driver, and that was at a time when that industry was regulated. It was pre-deregulation. In other words, it was a time when you could make a bit of money. So in terms of what I want to focus on is the point really that about the Cuban health system, because in order to understand the Cuban health system, you've got to understand Cuba itself, and by doing that, it takes you into account as a part of the rationale for what's actually happening now in Cuba, but as US led. Now, Cuba is, if I can read my notes here, is about nearly 111,000 square kilometres. Compare that with the South Island, which is somewhere around about 150 kilometres. But on that 111 square kilometres, there's a population of 11.5 million. And in this case, in the South Island, a population of about 1.25 million. But notwithstanding that, Cuba is still the biggest island in the Caribbean. I was, for a short period, maybe about 3 years, member of a Trotskyist organisation in the early 70s. And that's how I came to know Comrade Paul Pierce there. And once you know Paul Pierce, you never forget him, despite best endeavours. But what that sort of showed, what I'm getting at there really, is that at that particular time, the focus was very much within a narrow range of sort of Marxist thinkers that you tended to sort of look at and follow. And it was after leaving that I started to widen the look, and obviously it was at Che Guevara. Now, I have got a vague recollection that he did something brave in at the time, in the Bay of the Pigs and back in 61. Now, I didn't have a clue what it was, other than some naughty people tried to invade Cuba, and Che was part of the fight back. And then, without thinking about it anymore, I've got a recollection of his assassination in October 67 in Bolivia. And about 15, 16 years ago, I did the Che Guevara Trail in the province of Santa Cruz. And I learnt 2 things about that. The first was that guerrilla warfare is really, really hard work. It's not easy. And the second thing was that I concluded that I was designed for comfort. I wasn't designed for guerrilla warfare. But they were tough times, The next thing about Che really was in terms of the special period, which is when the collapse of the Soviet Union and all that followed from that. And Louise can talk more about that or know more about that than myself, but what that people drew on upon Che's sort of points in the discussions he led a couple of decades earlier on the relationship between material and moral incentives. And that's significant because if you just have material incentives, you have a particular sort of economy. You can never not have, well, it's very difficult not to have material incentives, but if you don't have moral ones, you're in trouble if you want to go into a different path. But you can't go on a different path without them. And it led on to a view that I've maintained for some time and still do, that simply life is a constant struggle. And if you don't have struggle, you don't have consciousness. So I visited Cuba when I finished up with the ASMS. The ASMS, with the full name Association of Salaried Medical Specialists, way back in the days when New Zealand first had a sense of humour, they called us the Alphabet Union. And it was quite witty, I had to admit. But my wife said to me that you've got to get the union out of your system, the ASMS union. So best way to do it was to spend about 6 weeks in the Caribbean. And I must admit, it worked. And that included a couple of weeks in Cuba, organised by ICAP, the Cuban Institute for Friendship with the Peoples. The minor thing about the blockade is that it had to be paid for. And I couldn't pay ICAP directly. I had to pay, with their advice and assistance, into a Spanish account that then could pay back ICAP. And that's the sort of, at a very low level, some of the silly stuff that happens. Magnify that and you're in trouble. And I was certainly struck in the 2 weeks that I was there with the level of social cohesion in the country. This was, not right now. This was before the blockade intensified. A very relaxed environment. And I had many meetings, including visiting a community health centre. And I had 3 regrets. One is that I was to have a meeting with economists, and that had to get canned because other things came up. The second thing is I never got to taste Cuba's own homemade ice cream. Maybe another trip. And the third thing was that I never actually got to ride in a vintage car. Helen Kelly, for the photograph up there, did manage to do that when she went not long before she passed away. I was struck in terms of equality or the relative lack of inequality with our tour guide. And our tour guide was who'd previously been in the diplomatic service, and the way he described it to me, he was sort of in a larger country, larger than New Zealand. He was a bit like a deputy ambassador or the second tier level. And so that, when you go from one to the other to a tour guide, it tells you something, a little crude indication. It was also interesting to see where we were staying, and a number of American medical students who were coming over to do internships and other things as well, which was a big plus. And the other thing that really struck me as well is these bloody cats everywhere. And I never really struggled to understand why there were so many cats, but they were friendly. They weren't feral. Until I understood, it was explained to me, I think by the medical director of a centre, because they had their own cat there, they were neighbourhood cats. So I thought to understand Cuba in terms of a more legalistic sense, it's useful to go to their constitution. They've had a constitution for many years. It's been revised over time. The last one there was 2019, and when I was over there, I had a session with a congresswoman there who was centrally involved in that development. And what it begins with is what you see up there. We, the people of Cuba, inspired by the heroism and patriotism of those that fought for a free, independent, sovereign and democratic homeland of social justice and human solidarity forged through the sacrifice of our ancestors. And then it goes on at some length. But the first group of ancestors they mention are the indigenous people of Cuba, most were wiped out, and slaves. And so it's quite a different type of constitution. And then under political foundations, Cuba is a democratic, independent and sovereign, organised by all and for the good of all, founded by the labour, dignity, humanism and ethic of its citizens for the enjoyment of liberty, equity, justice and equality, solidarity and individual and collective well-being and prosperity. Now, I don't think you'll see that, with the possible exception of Venezuela, maybe some other possibilities, of constitutions that are so proactive in terms of driving what actually happens and creating the scene for whatever happens. So then you move to the economic foundations. Cuba is governed by a socialist economic system based on the ownership by all people of the fundamental means of production. It's a nicer way of saying the socialisation of the means of distribution, exchange and production, or the other, wrong way around there. But as the primary form of property, as well as the planned direction of the economy, which considers, regulates and monitors the economy according to the interests of the society. And other parts of the Constitution, and these are just summaries of them, in terms of the economic foundations. The state directs, regulates and monitors economic activity and reconciling the interests of various parties and collective groups, etc. in that process. Workers participate in the processes of economic planning, regulation and monitoring. And the state promotes the advance of science, technology and innovation. And that's actually particularly important in terms of some of the things that Cuba has done in science, in medicine, at the high end of medicine, vaccines, and range of things that you simply would not imagine in a country of that size. So the economy emphasises very strongly social welfare programs, those that providing subsidised education, healthcare and food to its citizens. Its services sector is the largest contributor to gross domestic product, nearly 74%. That sector includes tourism and it includes healthcare. The industrial sector, agricultural food, agricultural cement production, textiles, regrettably tobacco, agricultural machinery, 24% of GDP. The important point to note is that the economy serves the people, not the other way around. That's very defining, and that can easily, a lot of people can say that about any economy without it as a soundbite. But this is expressed very much in the Constitution. And that's the contrast with capitalism. And that's where wealth accumulation through appropriation of surplus value is the prime driver of the economy. And that's the challenge that Cuba presents to countries like the US and many others, is the exact opposite of the drivers. And it says a lot about, the Constitution says quite a bit on healthcare. All citizens have the right to life, physical and moral integrity, justice, security and peace, health, education, culture, recreation, sports, and to their holistic development. And that makes public health a right of all people. The state is responsible for guaranteeing access at all levels and free of charge. The state guarantees the right to a healthy home, a clear linkage between the social determinants of health that drive much of the health cost in our country and the health of people. And the state responsibility to ensure that all people have the right to a healthy and adequate diet. Now, this is in the Constitution. And that highlights the importance that the country puts on Cuba. Puts on health. The health system itself And I had an opportunity to visit in Havana, a community health centre. The focus is very much to begin with on health prevention or population health, or in other words, doing the things necessary that people don't get sick in the first place as much as possible. Now, bear in mind that Cuba, since about 1960, 61, has had over 60 years anyway. Some people call it a blockade. I think economic warfare is perhaps a more appropriate term. But they've had that going on, and yet the life expectancy in Cuba is just, and this is World Bank data, just a bit above that of the most powerful economy in the world. Mm-hmm. Ironically, the country that has imposed the blockade on the country that's doing better. Mm-hmm. And you can see the comparisons there with 79.5 year life expectancy. Central America as a whole is 75.8, South America 76.6, the Caribbean is 73.4 years, and New Zealand is 83.1. But New Zealand has never been subjected to economic warfare. In terms of the health system that we've had, many of my arguments have been with decision makers, is how they go to structure comes first. In terms of reforming a system, changing a system, you change the structure. The Cuban system very much follows, the functions come first and the structure follows. And if we'd followed that approach, then our health system would be in a far better state than what it is at the moment. But the community health centres are really interesting. And as I said, I visited one in Havana. Family doctors and nurses, primary care, GP care. Family doctors is another way we would call them general practitioners. Strong focus on prevention care that I mentioned. That includes immunisations and visiting people in their homes about immunisations. I was talking to this about to Michael Baker, who's a prominent public health specialist. He was in the media a lot, and he almost salivated when he was here at the approach to immunisation. But it also is a strong neighbourhood focus. Dental surgery is provided, and hospital specialist outpatient clinics. They are the bigger community health centres are roughly the same size of some of our very smaller DHBs, former DHBs like Wairarapa, Whanganui, Tairāwhiti up in Gisborne and in the East Coast. The second tier is where it gets reasonably close to New Zealand, similar to New Zealand's district hospitals or secondary care, but they're 24/7 acute care and emergency departments for more complex conditions and for surgery outside dentistry. And then you have the specialised hospitals, as we have here, like Starship up in Auckland, and tertiary care. Now, tertiary is, I always got a bit confused about what tertiary care, and a medical specialist explained it to me, what compared with secondary care, one is what, the other one isn't. But a better way, but then he went on to say that essentially tertiary care are low volume, high complexity. And that's why we don't have neurosurgery, which is tertiary care, in every sort of main hospital in the country, because in so many of those areas there's not enough patients to justify the workforce. So there are referral processes. Now, vaccinations is fascinating, really, and bear in mind, I don't have a scientific background or a medical background. But Cuba, and I think this goes back, I think, Luis, to Fidel Castro, perhaps in the late 70s or that, but he put a strong push on developing more sort of high-tech or extending science into the medicine of sort of more high-end medicine in terms of vaccine production and other things, because with a blockade, if you're cut off from the things you need, you can't actually necessarily import vaccines, and Cuba had to develop its own. And it has. And some of them, a number of vaccines that they have, some of them are international collaborations. In days gone by, they were sometimes with in American universities, but in cancer, for example. But in the case of with COVID-19, they identified a number of vaccines or vaccine candidates. But the ones that, and up there, the three that developed, and the vaccination rate was incredibly high in Cuba. And that saved lives. And I've certainly argued, and others have argued, that New Zealand should actually consider develop its own vaccines and learn from Cuba, because it would make a lot of sense. We already do vaccines for animals. The Malagan Institute of Medical Research is called for it, and Brian Betty, who at that time was the medical director, he's a GP in Porirua, of the College of General Practitioners, he argued that we needed the ability to produce and develop vaccines independently of overseas pharmaceutical companies. That should be an urgent consideration. Because at the moment we have to deal with big pharma. They're arseholes, they are villains, but there was a market for them. They were never doing anything about vaccines for viruses until COVID came along, and then they did. We would have been, although I think we handled our vaccination introduction in New Zealand very well, we would have benefited by actually being able to do our own or get them from Cuba. So the vaccination rates, Cuba up there at 97, nearly 98%. That's incredibly high. New Zealand's not bad, 83, 84%. Canada at nearly 90%. US at 79%, and Germany is a kind of an indicator of centre of Europe at 77%. But that's a phenomenal figure. Those figures are taken in the different countries from either in 23 or 24. You don't do that, you don't get that rate if your focus is on material incentives. If your focus is on moral incentives, on the well-being of the population, you get that rate, and that makes the difference. And then, of course, there are the overseas medical missions. I won't say much about those because there is so much to say, but they're really providing medical services to underserved regions. The focus has generally been on Latin America, Africa, and the Pacific. And the reason why they've been able to achieve that is by the heavy investment in doctor and nursing training and numbers. And I'll get to the doctor's numbers in a minute. And when I was getting to the Che Guevara Trail, and we stopped at and stayed overnight at a small town close by, the guide was telling me about, just identifying as we were going out for a meal, a group of doctors walking along. He said, the Cuban doctors here, they're working, providing care for our people. I can never work out from our guide, my guide though, why he was very pro Che Guevara. He referred to him as the commander. He revered Che. And this was not long after the Morales government had come into being. And he hated the Morales government. And I can never work out whether he was a right-winger with a powerful sentimental connection with Che, or he's an ultra-left. Yeah. It could be either way, but I couldn't work it out. And I remember being in a health conference, policy conference, I think in Boston, not long after the Haiti earthquake. And a couple of doctors got up and talked there about the first doctors that arrived in Haiti were Cubans, very closely followed by those from Iceland as well. And Iceland's not too bad. Now, I think I should have warned you. I thought I should have given you a bucket first, a vomit bucket pool, but it is a funny world. It's what Margaret Thatcher said in the last cabinet meeting. She began it by saying after she got the axe, from such a powerful position she got the axe, and she said to her cabinet, it's a funny world. Well, Comrade Brownlee, I went to your last predecessor, Bar 1, hosted a function, well-attended function, not long after the Jacinda Ardern government came in. And Winston Peters was the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Deputy Prime Minister. He was there. But so was Jerry Brownlee. And we started talking. And he was out wondering about my interest in Cuba, and I was intrigued by his. And he said he went to Cuba as part of a diplomatic trip some years earlier. He got a bit crook, and so he was taken down to a community centre, and he just thought he'd be given some antibiotics or something. And he got a thorough examination, and he came away amazed. And I think that your immediate predecessor, one of the, I asked if he had a farewell function just before he left, and he said, I said, have you had any contact with Jerry Brownlee? And he said, yes, he was up here the other day. We had a cigar out on the deck there looking out. And he, of course, and you will recall because you were there, he hosted a function for the 21st anniversary of the of establishing an embassy, Cuban embassy in New Zealand. So Cuba has a supporter of sorts.
Like a rope supports a hanging man.
He's a bit too big to be. The rope wouldn't support him. So in summary, the points I would make is that the Cuban system is derived from its constitution, its health system, and that in turn is derived from the revolution itself. The constitution captures what the revolution aspired to and gave it powerful legal context and meaning. And that's how the system developed. So the role of the economy is to serve the people, not to enhance wealth accumulation. That doesn't mean to say that there's no trade and commerce in Cuba. In fact, we have trade and commerce are don't necessarily define capitalism by itself. Under feudalism, we had trade and commerce. We've had these hybrid societies over many years as one gradually transitions to another. And so, but the objective is to serve the people, and it's not wealth accumulation. And the role of the state in this context is both nationally and locally, is to protect and enhance healthcare as a basic right in a way that we go nowhere near in New Zealand. They put the function before the form or the structure of the system, and they also recognise the importance of sustainable health in a workforce. So there's a strong emphasis on health promotion and health protection, by way of example, big example, immunisation. There's a strong emphasis on health services being from community to tertiary being accessible. There's a strong emphasis on high-end science, including vaccines, and there's a strong emphasis on internationalism. I thought I had a slide here on the doctors who are trained and the per capita rate of doctors in Cuba. And it's all I can say, but unfortunately it's not there. All I can say, it is the highest in the world, and it is well above many countries, including New Zealand, Australia. And that's a reflection of how Cuba invests in health. If you don't invest in your workforce, and they wouldn't have the medical missions that they do if they didn't have that per capita range. So I think that is the lot, unless Yeah, that's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. So about to call you Colin at that point. Don't know if there's a family relationship, but it was a very different presentation from what I'd like to get from him. Thank you very much. That was incredibly informative, and I love what you said about Cuba's approach to health and their economy coming back to the Constitution. And something I often say is that the question we need to be asking in New Zealand is not how much will it cost, but what do we need? And to have Cuba as an example of a state that looks at what the human need is rather than how much it will cost as the first response is actually really, really uplifting. So thank you so much for that. Another round of applause for Cal. Our next presenter this evening, Dr. Josephine Varghese, and I'll introduce her in 5 minutes after you have a chance to have a break. Her particular area of interest is geopolitical analyses, and particularly in the post-colonial and Marxist theory approach. And I think that's interesting, that there is a post-colonial thought, given that while some people talk about post-colonialism in New Zealand, I don't think we're in it yet, because we still have a settler government, very much so. And if you looked at the last general election, you would have seen that very clearly. So without further ado, and with gratitude for Josephine being with us tonight, please put your hands together and give a warm welcome to Josephine Varghese.
Thank you so much, Nath. And kia ora, my comrades. Before I start, I would like to teach you something I learned from Cuba. It is one of the first sentences I learned in Spanish when I arrived in Havana in December 2025. And it goes like this, because it was on purpose, right? I asked people, this is the first sentence I want to learn. How do you say death to the empire in And this lovely man who I met in Cuba taught me, the slogan is like this, abajo el imperialismo. And then you will respond with abajo. Can you say it?
Abajo.
Abajo el imperialismo.
Abajo.
That's it. So let's begin. So here we go. Cuba and our collective struggle against imperialism. We must locate Cuba's struggle not as an isolated struggle, but as part of the global struggle against imperialism. And that's what my talk is going to focus on today. And before I start, I want to quote, unfortunately, our finance minister, Nicola Willis, who just yesterday said that, reassured New Zealand people saying, don't worry, there are fluctuations and problems and disruptions happening in the global oil market. However, there are 13 tankers coming en route to New Zealand at the moment, and this will give us 52 days worth of buffer. Now, this is interesting because suddenly everyone is waking up to the reality of an oil embargo. Now, this has been the reality for Cuba for the last 3 months. Not a single oil tanker, not 13, not a single oil tanker has arrived in Cuba in the last 3 months. And just thinking about Ian's talk there and about how he mentioned the focus on well-being, that there, to me, is the success of a worker-organized state. When the working class holds power, then workers' rights, come to the top. And here we are at the Ōtautahi Trade Union Center, and we must remember that Cuba is a successful example of workers' rights coming into power. And this is exactly the impression I got when I was there. I was impressed with the achievements of a state that is organized not by the bourgeoisie, but by the workers. Okay? So we are currently living through the age, I'm going to term it, the age of hyper-imperialism. And I'm not alone in terming it hyper-imperialism. Many people say this is the case. Some people say that, the United States is in decline, and this is the final, fireworks before it dies off. We hope that it dies off. But the time that I was going to Cuba, this is, there was a before, a during, and an after of hyper-imperialism. So, I get this golden opportunity to present a paper at the University of Havana. And, I considered it the pinnacle of my career to this day, to be presenting at an anti-imperialist conference in Havana, of all places, to meet some of the revolutionaries and the people who fought apartheid, for example, in the southern part of Africa. Also to learn about this worker organized state called Cuba. So let me talk about before my trip, during, and after, just to take stock of the times that we are currently living in. Before I went to Cuba, Trump was threatening Venezuela day by day. In November, Trump closed the airspace of Venezuela. This is an act of imperialism. How can a guy sitting in Washington say to another sovereign country that their airspace is closed? This is not acceptable. But, the war drums were beating at the time. There were increasing attacks on common people, fisher folk off the coast of Venezuela and Colombia. Normal fisher folk going on fishing trips being killed like hunting game for no reason. This is like a sport. The lives of people in the Caribbean, in Latin America, in Asia, don't mean anything to the empire. It's less than the worth of pets of the bourgeoisie in the imperial call. Our lives are less worth than that. And before my trip to Cuba was also the age of the live stream genocide, which we all watched through. The whole-scale slaughter of people in schools, in hospitals, point-blank sniping of children, 8 points, which became massacre points, right? So the imperial crisis is at its peak at the moment. Now, during my time in Cuba, that's when they kidnapped Maduro. Not only Maduro did they kidnapped his wife, who in her own right has a history of left-wing activism and politics. She's a lawyer and a strategist for the Chavez revolution, the Bolivarian revolution over there. And she and Maduro, whom, contrary to the Western media narrative, is the legitimate leader of Venezuela. The legitimate sovereign leader of Venezuela is sitting in a prison in New York. Is this an acceptable situation? And nobody mentioned a thing. New Zealand didn't mention a thing. None of the imperial core nations mentioned a thing. Cuba was different, obviously. Cuba made statements. Cuba had big protest movements as well, opposing this. Now, we will talk about that. So during my time there, they basically invaded, conducted a effective kind of power change in Venezuela, and over 100 people died, right? Trump said it was completely clean, nothing happened. No. Over 100 people died, 32 of them were Cuban, okay? And people ask, why were Cubans in Venezuela? Cuba has a long history of thwarting assassination attempts, right? So Cuban military is specialized in this. How many assassination attempts were there against Fidel Castro? Can anyone guess?
Dozens.
Dozens? Yeah, according to one source, it was above 600.
Ooh.
According to others, it's somewhere around 100, okay? So there were definitely a lot of attempts, and Cuban military was, able to overcome those threats, and therefore they supported their sister revolutionary state of Venezuela. Now, after I left, I leave Cuba, taking so many lessons from this successful worker-organized state. But I leave Cuba with a bleeding heart because the embargo is ongoing. It still hasn't received a single drop of oil. All the countries that provided oil to Cuba have been punished or threatened by the imperial hegemon. And this is why I have left Cuba with a bleeding heart, but with a mission, a renewed mission, which is my life mission, is to destroy the US empire. Now, after I left, we have new crises. Now, there's a war against Iran, right? And are these crises interrelated? Absolutely. Cuba sees it as an interrelated, the same struggle against imperialism. In fact, Fidel visited Tehran in 2002, and he said to the students of the Tehran University, who were thronging in a huge crowd, 700 of them, many of them couldn't enter the auditorium because it was full. And he said, the Shah of imperialism will fall too. You dethroned the puppet Shah regime, and he said, we together will dethrone the Shah that is imperialism. Now, let's remember what Che Guevara said. He said this, while envisaging the destruction of imperialism, which is what we all envisage, it is necessary to identify its head. Its head is none other than the United States of America. And this continues to guide our praxis against imperialism. Now, during my time there were two speeches. And afterwards, you probably recognize these speeches, do you? Yeah, so the first one is who? Mark Carney. He became a darling of the liberals across the world because of the speech. But ultimately, the message I took away from this speech is similar to the message that this guy gave, a Gusano. So, his name is Marco Rubio. And he said that, we stand, whatever happens, America is a child of Europe, and we stand basically for Western supremacy, is basically what he said. The thing is, both of these speeches, the first one was saying that we need to move away from US imperialism in some ways, like it was a very centrist kind of position, but both of them got standing ovations from audiences in Europe. Ultimately, they're not saying different things. The message that Mark Carney said, which I have taken from his speech, is this: we want to be at the table with the imperial core. He said this: if we are not at the table, we are on the menu. Do you remember? And that's all he wanted to avoid. He wants, he's fine with imperialism as long as they are at the table with those who are committing imperialism, and he is against Canada becoming at the receiving end of imperialism. So, this is also very funny. Trump sometimes does such good work in exposing the ugliness of the empire. And he released this private message from Emmanuel Macron. And it goes like this. My friend, we are totally in line on Syria. We can do great things with Iran. I do not understand what you are doing on Greenland. Let us try to build great things. So he's like, you can do whatever you want in Asia, Africa, Latin America, but don't touch our colonies, European colonies. Greenland is a colony, right, of Denmark. Don't touch there. I don't know if you remember the scene from The Godfather second part. It was New Year's Eve, and it's in Havana, 1958. This is the eve of the revolution, right? And if you watch this movie, you'll see that Batista and the gangsters, like this is Godfather, right? The gangsters from the United States, Havana was the play pod of them. It was rife with, organized crime, mafia, sex work, human trafficking. This is what Havana was. It was a puppet of the US empire, and it was a gang pad, extremely unsafe and extremely exploitative. And you see in this movie, as the midnight strikes, Batista and the gangsters are escaping Havana in small planes. And the day after this is January 1st, Victory Day, the victory of the revolution. On the 8th of January, Fidel Castro arrives with the procession of the victorious revolution into Havana. So I planned my trip so that I could be there during Victory Day, okay? Now, being in Cuba during the age of hyper-imperialism was quite interesting because it actually, there was so much anti-imperialism everywhere, right? People all know anti-imperialist chants like Abajo el imperialismo, Abajo, okay? And these are some examples of what I was able to do when I was in Cuba. This is a Palestinian student from Gaza. He was on full scholarship studying medicine in Havana. And he was one of the keynote speakers at the conference that I participated in. And he spoke about the connected or the same struggle or the one struggle that the people in Gaza and Palestine were going through and connecting it back to Cuba. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. But this is from the largest anti-imperialist march I've ever been to in my whole life. And behind me is Miguel Diaz-Canel, comrade, the current leader of Cuba, the leader of the assembly, and he was one of the closest people to Fidel Castro. And the thing is, the march, we marched through the Malecon, which is the beautiful waterfront in Havana. And we walked past this ugly building, which houses the US Embassy. And people were, they were using expletives. They were showing the middle finger. And then beyond that, we walked towards this place where all the Cuban leadership was right there. And guess what? I actually got to speak with them. I said, soy comunista de la India. I said, I am a communist from India. And they were all so welcoming, and they gestured and they smiled in very positive ways. I got to speak with the leader of Cuba. This is huge. These are the people at the front lines. They're risking their lives fighting imperialism on behalf of the whole world. So I hold them with great respect. Now, this is a cool uncle, comrade, Jorge, who I met at the Fidel Castro Center. Both his parents were revolutionaries. They marched into Havana alongside Fidel Castro. He was only 4 years old at the time of the revolution. And currently, he's one of the staff members who teaches people who come to the Fidel Center about the history of Cuba. Also looking at how, Cuba has a very cosmopolitan international kind of culture. This is a young man I met in Havana. We were just having food. And we came across him. And obviously, when South Asians see each other in a very different place, we kind of say, hey, what are you doing here? So he's from Sri Lanka. He arrived in Cuba 10 years prior on a full scholarship studying health sciences He did a bachelor's, master's, and PhD, and he works with the Cuban volleyball team at the moment. And he's married there in Havana with children. Now, another thing I noticed was racial justice. The approach to racial justice and economic justice that Cuba has. So in New Zealand, for example, we have a very, we talk about diversity, inclusion, stuff like that. But generally, it's like, the CEOs and executives of arms companies, how many women are there? Mm-hmm. How many black people are in the executive board of one of those companies? Arms companies. But that's not the model of racial justice in Cuba. The racial justice model is actually land back in practice. We say land back over here. Fidel actually did that. Fidel and his comrades, they did land back. The very homes that were built by the enslaved Afro-Cuban population, now those families are living there. That is a model of racial justice, that we can want to emulate. Now, this gentleman is Comandante Victor Dreke. He was second in command to Che Guevara in his mission to Congo. And he was also one of the keynotes at the conference. And in the post-revolutionary period, he was quite instrumental in the racial justice policies. But he also leads the Committee on Preserving the Revolution. I also want to talk about, the public spirit, safety, despite scarcity. There's a lot of scarcity in Cuba at the moment, material scarcity. When I talk about Cuba, people say to me, you went to Cuba. Cuba's like, time stands still, right? And I was like, maybe on a superficial material level, that's the case. But when it comes to the social and communitarian values, it's far ahead in the future. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So on New Year's Eve, I was wondering, where will I go for a party? And I stepped out of my accommodation, and the party was on the street. The grandmas are there, the babies are there, the children, we're all just dancing together. I remember at 2 a.m., I saw this old grandma walking through the street by herself, and I was concerned, is she okay? Does she have a place to go? And she was totally fine. Cuba is one of the safest countries. Still, despite this intensified genocidal embargo, that redistribution of material wealth has created, social cohesion, safety, and, reduced crime. This moment in history that we live in demands that we rethink the dominant understandings of the world. We need to develop a sound understanding of the operation of imperialism. My presentation at the University of Havana looked at Che Guevara's approach to imperialism as reflected in his message to the Tricontinental. And I looked at what lessons we can learn from that message for today's context. Like more contemporary scholars in imperialism, Che too approached imperialism not merely as a tendency of big countries, right? That's how a lot of people in the West understand imperialism, as like every big country or every country that has power is an imperialist country. Che didn't subscribe to that view. Che looked at imperialism as a world system. Sorry.
You stood on it.
Yeah.
No, on the wall, you stood on it.
Oh, no. Okay. Che looked at imperialism as a world system. And when you look at more contemporary scholars, they look at imperialism also, not as just an ism or a tendency, and there are multiple imperialisms. No, we need to identify the top power and how the global financial system works, how the knowledge systems work, how the global military network works, right? And so when you have that, a materialist approach, a historical materialist approach, we can say that indeed the United States is the imperial hegemon. Che also critiqued the dominant Western approach to peace, which is the lack of war, because he was interested in looking at structural violence. And he understood that even after the end of the World War II, there was so much violence against the Third World, and this doesn't indicate that there was peace. And he also talks about the Korean War, in which like 10 to 20% of the population of DPRK was killed. And, Pyongyang was flattened like Gaza. So he looks at that and he critiques the notions that peace existed after World War II. Now, this is from my presentation at the university. And these were the interpreters who live translated my speech to Spanish. Now, this young woman, she's a lecturer at the University of Havana in the Interpretation Studies department. And this young woman was her student. And it was really interesting how they set the whole thing up for the conference. Now, what is the status of the world today? It's been 81 years since the end of the World War, but it's instability, poverty, super exploitation. Therefore, there's a continued relevance for anti-imperialist thought that the Tricontinental Conference in 1966 upheld. Now, I just want to quickly talk about the global imperial system. So just making it into your minds that imperialism is not just a tendency or an ism, it's actually a system, a global system, which is, a network of connected institutions through which, this is the important thing. If you can take one thing away from today, this is what I want you to take away. Imperialism is the instrument or the set of processes which enforces capitalism globally. So imperialism is not just capitalism. It is a system of processes and infrastructure through which capitalism and capitalist exploitation is imposed across the world and enforced across the world, right? So from that perspective, it is the United States and its allies that are imperialist in nature. If you look at China, for example, they're not imposing capitalism. In fact, they are friends of non-capitalist states like North Korea and Cuba and so forth. They're not trying to impose capitalism on other sovereign nations. And why is the Cuban model so important, and why has Cuba become a target of the empire? How am I for time?
Over.
You're good?
Yeah.
Okay. Cuba is a threat to the empire, according to this young man who is from Gaza. In his speech, he said, in Cuba, when you come to study medicine, you don't just become a medical professional. Cuba trains you to be a revolutionary, like Che Guevara. And he said to me, I rose up after his presentation. Most people were moved to tears because there was also a documentary called From Gaza to Cuba. I highly recommend this documentary. It's available on YouTube. And I said, it was really powerful because it shows the connected nature of our struggles. And he said, yes, Gaza is being flattened because Gaza is in a geopolitically significant region and the empire cannot allow sovereignty there, right? Any sovereign movements in the Middle East threaten access to resources, access to trade routes, and so forth. And therefore, Gaza's, Palestinian sovereign movement is not acceptable. Iran's sovereignty is not acceptable. He said, Cuba, on the other hand, it doesn't have so many resources. It's not in a huge resource-rich island. But he said, what Cuba represents is an idea with which we can defeat imperialism. The threat of a good example, right? They want to make sure that that good example is destroyed. Now, as Ian said, Cuba performs better than the United States on key human development indicators, not just life expectancy, but also education, health, maternal mortality, crime. Crime is so low. Housing, right? So I arrived in Cuba after spending 7 days in Vancouver, Canada, and I was shocked by the level of homelessness in Vancouver, one of the rich cities in settler colonial Canada, is people just increasingly homeless during the peak of winter. And some of them are collapsing. And then the whole city just moves on as if it's normal. The fentanyl crisis from the United States has crossed the borders and arrived in Canada. And then I arrived in Cuba, and I couldn't see that level of homelessness anywhere. I looked for it, and I inquired. Apparently, there's some homelessness now, but it's negligible. It's not really visible in the way that it is in Western cities. So this is the model that is a threat to capitalism, right? The continued existence of capitalism and capitalist imperialism. So before the revolution, like I said, it was a hub for international organized crime, high levels of corruption. After 1959, the state drastically reduced violent crime and so forth, right? And here is an example of a successful program. And the other day I was listening to our comrades from the Philippines, and they had gone to the rural parts of the Philippines and asked the people, what do you want? And the people said, we want education. And Cuba achieved that, right? Cuba eradicated literacy within the span of 8 months or 1 year. So in September 26, 1960, during his first speech before the United Nations, Fidel made a commitment of eliminating illiteracy. He said, Cuba will be the first country in America within a few months that can say it does not have a single illiterate person. And they did. Other examples of transformation of Cuba, you can look at it. Inequality, healthcare, life expectancy, infant mortality, all these things. Housing, and so forth. The Cuban embargo, like Ian said, is an economic warfare. And when I was there, I wasn't able to access my card or my bank account. I called up ANZ and I said, what's going on? New Zealand doesn't sanction or embargo Cuba, so why can't I use my New Zealand card here? They said that they are following the US laws. Because every transaction, MasterCard, Visa, it goes through New York, the headquarters. And they have been fined in the past for allowing it, so they don't. And they said that this is also part of our ethical policy against terrorism or something. And I said, which other countries apply? And they said, North Korea, Iran. And so you see, these are the target states, and Russia, I think they mentioned. We look at these countries as other imperialisms. I say that they are the target states of the empire. Now, there are 2 additional unresolved problems. This is from Duarte Diaz in 2018. He says, it's not only the economic warfare, but there's also ideological and information warfare going on. There's illegal radio and television broadcasts from the United States against Cuba, which kind of shows Cuban government in a bad light, trying to turn the people against their government. There's also programs aimed at destabilizing and subverting the Cuban constitutional order. So the United States is not only doing an economic warfare, but it's also doing an information warfare. So if you studied Marxist theory of base and superstructure, the United States is actually attacking Cuba on both dimensions. The Cuban model of internationalism is so remarkable, right? They laid over 3,000 lives in the fight against apartheid in South Africa. And European and Western countries were like, why are they going to Angola? Maybe they want their diamonds. Maybe they want their minerals. The idea of internationalism based on solidarity and the common goal of destroying empire is just not, it doesn't enter the heads of the capitalist empire. They provided material support to the Palestinian resistance a military training, and also support for the PLO in the 1970s. Che Guevara visited Gaza in 1959, soon after the revolution. 1959 was the revolution. He visited Gaza in 1959. Also education, scholarships, right? And providing medical missions. They provided medical missions to Africa during Ebola crisis, to Italy during COVID crisis. They offered medical missions to the United States during Katrina, and the United States rejected it. It would have helped many people there, right? But recently I've been hearing a lot of growing concerns. This is my last bit, okay? Maybe 5 more minutes or so. When I talk to my activist friends, my comrades from around the world, they have the sense of creeping pessimism, right? So, for example, Trump is now, he's losing in Iran, right? And this is a very, egotistical maniac. Cuba is much more smaller and easier, probably, for the United States to destroy or attack or something. So increasingly, my comrades around the world are saying, there's just a sense of pessimism. What is going to happen to Cuba? And this was also part of my bleeding heart, I told you earlier. It was also my worry about what's going to happen to this revolution, which proved that putting the needs of people above the needs of profit is actually successful, despite, economic warfare and so forth. But this is the reason why I have hope. And this is what I'm going to show you before I end. What is the Cuban state? What is the model? Western liberals like Zohran Mamdani, he called Cuba a dictatorship. So does everyone in the Democrats and the Republicans. They all call Cuba a dictatorship. But to the contrary, Cuba has a workers' state. It's a workers' state with a participatory democracy. It's not the same democracy as we have here, but I'll give you some features of it. We don't have much time. One of the key features of it is the Cuban Communist Party, right? PCC, Partido Comunista de Cuba. And 1/6 of the Cuban population are members in this party. And becoming a member is not an easy thing. It's a thing of honor. You have to prove your worth. And you got to get nominated by fellow workers. So your comrades have to nominate you to become a member, and then you're a member candidate for a year. And then if you prove yourself, then you can become a member of the Communist Party. Number one. Number two is the Cuban state operates through mass organizations. The first one is the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution. There's also the Cuban Women's Federation, the trade unions. So the trade unions are integrated into the structure of the state. The Association of Small Farmers. Almost all adults in Cuba belong to one or more of these organizations. And these organizations are actively participating in the policy making of the Cuban state. Does that make sense? There's also the organs of popular power. There's provincial and national governments. There are locally elected delegates who don't even need to be part of the Communist Party. They have a right to recall them. There's a National Assembly and provincial assemblies. So the West tries to say that any model that's not the Western model of multi-party bourgeois politics, they say every other model is a dictatorship. But actually, the Cuban model might be more democratic, right? Because it's not only participatory in its decision-making, it also assures that people have a stake in the economic base of their nation, a democratic economy as well. The common struggle between Cuba and Iran, I talked about this. I just want to finish my presentation with this statement from Che Guevara. Our every action is a battle cry against imperialism and a battle hymn for the people's unity against the great enemy of humankind, the United States of America. Patria o muerte, which means homeland or death. And then people respond with venceremos. Can you do that? Venceremos. Patria o muerte.
Venceremos.
Venceremos means we will overcome. Okay? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Varghese.
Did you?
People before profit. That is certainly a rallying cry. And thank you for your message and for speaking to us about your visit on the ground in Cuba. That's hopeful, so hopeful. Yeah.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Another round of applause, please, for Dr. Varghese. Okay, we're going to move straight on to our third speaker, and we're really honoured to have with us this evening His Excellency, the Ambassador to New Zealand from Cuba, actually to New Zealand, the Cook Islands and Niue, from what I understand. And so we have the great privilege of hearing from him. I just want to say that while he's the ambassador for Cuba, he's also had experience representing Cuba in Turkey, in Germany, and his background is in political science, I understand, and you're a professor in political science at university. So he has a background in politics that is broad. And so we're very, it's a great honour to be able to hear this evening from His Excellency Luis Rodríguez. A big round of applause, please.
It's very difficult to say something after Josephine's presentation, because I'm sure that she's a good teacher or professor of the university, but at the same time, she could be a good actress also. It's very difficult not to be convinced after her, to listen to her own experiences in Cuba. But first of all, I would like to thank all of you for being here today. Also to my colleagues Ian and Josephine for their wonderful presentation. I remember that, you were talking about the Cuba illiteracy campaign, and I remember that I had the opportunity to visit New Zealand the first time in 2004 and 2005. At that time, I was advisor of our Minister of Education, and we have a small team of Cuban teachers collaborating with Te Wānanga Ōtautahi University in Hamilton in the implementation of some illiteracy program in different Maori communities. So it was a great experience for me at that time, but of course, I didn't imagine that I'm coming back as an ambassador later. So I don't prepare any presentation like them. I just write some ideas that I would like to share with you. I would like to begin with a simple reflection. We are living in a moment when the international system is being tested. Increasingly, we see the logic of power challenging the logic of law. For countries like Cuba, small countries, international law is not an abstract concept. It is our main protection. On January 29 this year, the President of the United States declared a national emergency, claiming that Cuba represents an unusual and extraordinary threat to U.S. national security. Let us pause for a moment and reflect on that statement. Cuba is a Caribbean island of 10 million people. We do not possess nuclear weapons. We do not have military base abroad. We do not project military power internationally. And yet, we are described as an extraordinary threat. But this declaration is not merely rhetorical. It has very concrete consequences. The executive order allows the US to impose tariff on countries supplying fuel to Cuba. it intensifies the economic blockade, and it increases pressure on the third countries engaging in normal economic relations with my country. In practical terms, the objective is simple: to restrict Cuba's access to energy. Now, when the fuel is restricted in a country, the consequences are not theoretical. Hospitals are affected, public transportation is affected, food production is affected, daily life is affected. In other words, the entire society is affected. That is why Cuba has described these measures as economic coercion and collective punishment. From the perspective of international law, the situation raises fundamental questions. These sanctions were not authorized by the United Nations Security Council. They penalize third countries for trading with a sovereign state, and they challenge basic principles of the international system: sovereign equality, non-intervention, and freedom of commerce. These principles are not ideological. They are the foundation of the rules-based international order that countries like New Zealand have long defended. This brings us to another recent statement. The US Secretary of State recently said that Cuba needs to change and that Cuba needs economic freedom. At the first hearing, that phrase sounds positive. Who could be against freedom? But the real question is, what does economic freedom mean in practice? For more than 60 years, Cuba has built a social model based on universal access to basic rights. Education is free from preschool to university. Healthcare is universal and free. And despite limited resources, Cuba developed its own biotechnology sector, including vaccine against COVID-19 during the pandemic. These are not ideological claims. They are internationally documented achievements. So, we must ask a reasonable questions. Would economic freedom mean dismantling universal education? Would it mean turning healthcare into private market commodity? Would it mean that access to health or education depends on how much money a family has? These are not abstract questions. They go to the heart of how society defines fairness and human dignity. History also provides important context. In 1960, a US State Department memorandum stated that policy towards Cuba should aim to weaken the country economically in order to generate hardship and political change. More than 60 years later, many observers see continuity in the current sanction regime. Over 240 additional sanctions were imposed in recent years. Cuba was placed on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. Pressure of banks and companies doing business with the island, and even campaigns aimed at discouraging countries from cooperating with Cuba medical missions. So again, we must ask, can there truly be economic freedom while the longest system of economic sanctions in modern history remains in place? There is also an important development worth mentioning. Recently, the first Secretary of the Communist Party of Cuba and the President of the Republic, Miguel Díaz-Canel, confirmed that Cuba officials have held conversations with representatives of the government of the United States. These exchanges, conducted with discretion and responsibility, are aimed at exploring possible solutions to the bilateral differences that exist between our two countries. According to the Cuban government, the objective of these discussions is twofold. First, to identify the most pressing bilateral issues that require practical solutions because of their seriousness and their impact on both societies. Second, to evaluate whether there is a genuine willingness on both sides to take concrete steps that could benefit the people of both countries. Another important aspect of these talks is the possibility of identifying areas of cooperation. This includes cooperation to address common challenges and to contribute to stability, security, and peace in the region of the Latin American and the Caribbean. Cuba has reiterated that it is willing to engage in such a dialogue based on sovereign equality, mutual respect for political system, and full respect for national sovereignty and self-determination. In other words, dialogue is possible, but only based on reciprocity and international law. Let me be clear. Cuba does not claim perfection. We face economic challenges. We debate reforms. We continue searching for solutions. But we do so under extraordinary and external pressure. And despite these pressures, Cuba maintains certain principles. Education is a right, healthcare is a right, and national sovereignty is not negotiable. This conversation is therefore not only about Cuba. It is about the kind of international system we want. A system governed by rules, or a system governed by power. A system based on cooperation, or one based on coercion. Cuba chooses dialogue. Cuba chooses cooperation. Cuba believes differences between nations should be resolved through respect, diplomacy, and international law. This is why discussions like this one here in New Zealand are so valuable, because they allow us to talk openly, respectfully, and honestly. And I will conclude with the words of José Martí, Cuba's national hero. The homeland is sacred, and those who love it without interest or fatigue own in the whole truth. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rodríguez.
Thank you.
Seems so simple, right? To provide those basic things as a right, as a human right. And I think there are many people in New Zealand who would say those things are human rights too. But every 3 years, and this year, is an election year, we vote for people who don't say those things, who don't think they are an inalienable human right. In fact, they put policies in place that ensure they aren't. And to hear you speak like that is very, very refreshing. So thank you. Another round of applause. I should have announced this earlier, apparently, but if any of you have any Cuban cigars with you tonight, you can't smoke them inside. They have to be done outside. But
Even Fidel gave up.
oh, did he? Yeah, but it's coming back in New Zealand now. You know that, right? Yeah, right, yeah. That's not an encouragement to do so. Our final speaker this evening is Dr. David Small from the University of Canterbury. And in the Department of Cultural and Social, the School of Social Cultural Studies. Now, for those who have been around a while, you may be familiar with Dr. Small. He's someone who's been of peculiar interest for his involvement in a whole range of activities that have sought to increase the public's awareness of the tools of empire, I guess you would say. And as a result, he was particularly of interest to security intelligence services over the years. And I've been very grateful, among many other Kiwis, for the work that he has done to highlight the breaches of some of the civil liberties, and particularly in relation to privacy. And it became apparent to me when the terror raids occurred in the Urueras early this century, that everything that was being said and written and spoken through many forms of different communication were being collected, and they had telephone books on those that they had been putting particular attention on. And those weren't people that were aware that was happening, they weren't warranted, but just those kinds of activities Dr. Small has drawn attention to over the years. I'm very grateful for that. And so without further ado, I'd like to hand the time over to Dr. Small with a round of applause.
Kia ora koutou, ko David Small tōku ingoa. I'm very pleased to be here tonight, and I've been a big admirer of Cuba. I like the ambassador. I've got no slides, but I have written down words, which is not that usual for me, but I thought that will keep me focused without too many sidetracks. So I will, and hopefully keep me on time. So, yeah, for my entire life, Cuba's been an inspiration to the world. The Cuban people were able to liberate themselves from extreme forms of exploitation and domination. And they were able to sustain that revolution for decades in the face of extraordinary opposition, economic sanctions, military aggression, and constant political pressure. The form of exploitation the Cuban Revolution overthrew was common to countries of the global south. Countries previously we used to refer to as the third world. There's no perfect term for it, let's call them the global south. Right through the 1960s and 70s and 80s. In many different countries, revolutionary movements sought to emulate Cuba's achievements, but very few succeeded. In Nicaragua, there was a successful revolution, but they were unable to withstand the level of opposition and sabotage and attacks that they were subjected to. Others found electoral ways to come to power, only to find extraordinary attacks and obstruction from the US, right to the point of the demonstration of the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro that we've all witnessed. But Cuba survived. Cuba survived the Cold War era when it was right on the doorstep of Western imperialism. Cuba survived what this thing called the Cuban Missile Crisis, and as an indication of how profound and distorting the media and the education system is that we've grown up in. I only recently found out the background to this thing called the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was what we're told is that this was the Soviet Union moving missiles into Cuba in this big, provocative, aggressive move against the United States. But what I only found out recently is that that was in response to the United States doing that in Turkey aimed at the Soviet Union. It wasn't an initiative just like that, but that's not the story that we're all told. So Cuba survived all that. It survived the end of the Cold War as well, which saw the US emerge as the sole global superpower, and the emergence of what's been called the unipolar era. In this unipolar era, the US exerted its power all over the world, politically, militarily, and economically. A major aspect of this was the global imposition of neoliberalism. This model of deregulated capitalism was forced on the whole world, and particularly on countries of the global south. Institutions like the IMF and the World Bank used the indebtedness of countries to force them to adopt what were called structural adjustment policies. This was a package of neoliberal policies that required countries to open their economies to maximum penetration and exploitation by global capital, forcing them to float their currencies, remove tariffs, remove subsidies, basically leave them open to any sort of economic exploitation. The plan was to create a global deregulated economy that would allow capital to move freely across national borders to settle wherever it could find maximum possibilities of exploitation and to relocate at the first sign of trouble. Since colonial times, national economies of colonies have been organised so that they would favour the development of the colonial power at the expense of the colonised people. But neoliberal globalisation greatly intensified the possibilities for this form of exploitation, and it was accompanied by weakening the political power and autonomy of nation states. Their economies became beholden to the whim of international capital and financiers. For decades, we saw the intensification of exploitation and extraction and the creation of economic systems that would transfer wealth from the poor to the rich. The system that transferred wealth from the poor to the rich became more and more entrenched, and the level of inequality between rich and poor, both within countries and internationally between countries, widened dramatically. At the same time as the collective West was pushing these systems of economic exploitation, the US was also flexing its military muscle. The first big military confrontation of the unipolar era, the post-Cold War era, was the invasion of Iraq. Here we saw the US, backed by the collective West, fabricate the story about Iraq having weapons of mass destruction in order to justify their predetermined decision to invade and destroy Iraq. The world saw for the first time laser-guided Tomahawk missiles delivering massive explosive power with pinpoint accuracy. It was a demonstration to the world that, in the words of George Bush at the time, what we say goes. So we were in a period of unipolar power where the United States was the sole superpower, the sole hegemon in the world. It advanced its economic interests by pushing neoliberalism, and it advanced its political and strategic interests by overwhelming military power. The US made the rules. It required the rest of the world to follow the rules, and if there was any risk that these rules might be questioned or transgressed, it would use or threaten the use of overwhelming military power to force the transgressor to abide by the rules. This is what they called the rules-based order. However, in the last 4 or 5 years, this unipolar world with the US as the global hegemon has started to come unstuck. Economically, it's being challenged by the rise of China. China is one of the few countries in the world where the US was unable to impose neoliberalism. The effect of that was that China did not lose control over the direction and strategies of its economic development. And it chose strategies that were not only designed to assist development in China, but also that would ensure that it was not so vulnerable to the vagaries of international markets or the pressure and bullying and domination of the United States. The US tried to impede and obstruct China's development by imposing economic sanctions, by putting on technological boycotts, and by political pressure by any means they could think of. And last year, Donald Trump announced sweeping tariffs on most countries in the world, including its American allies. Countries that had been locked into the neoliberal model were extremely vulnerable to this sort of pressure, and many of them were forced to buckle. But China stared down the US threats, and in Busan last November, after the APEC meeting, at the most recent meeting of President Xi and President Trump, Trump was forced to back down. China threw him a few soybean purchases so he could pretend it wasn't a back down, but everybody knew that it was, including Trump. He ended up agreeing a tariff rate for China that was the same as what he agreed with the EU, who were supposed to be US allies. The bipolar world ended with Gorbachev agreeing to dismantle the Soviet Union. I think the unipolar era of American hegemony ended with Trump backing down in China. That was the end of the universal hegemony of neoliberalism. China had become too economically strong and self-reliant to be forced into submission. Politically, I think the beginning of the end of the unipolar era happened in Gaza. It was the inhumane, depraved, murderous, indefensible genocide in Gaza that fundamentally altered and I think permanently destroyed any moral authority that the collective West might previously have had. The whole world could see the inhumane genocidal slaughter. And while we were watching it, every Western leader was telling us that what we could see was not actually happening. An extraordinary attempt at global gaslighting, and one that failed completely. It failed so badly that one of those leaders, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, who Josephine referred to, eventually let the cat out of the bag. He confessed that everything progressives had been saying over the last decades was correct, that the political and economic and military objectives of the collective West had been entirely oriented to advance their own interests at the expense of the poor and the weak, while trying to disguise this naked self-interest. Carney admitted that they were only ever pretending to stand for democracy and freedom and justice. They were actually all in it for themselves. And now we have the attack on Iran. Given the genocide and the Carney confession, the world now knows 100% without any doubt that the purpose of this attack had nothing to do with the well-being of the people of Iran. The political damage the US has suffered is now making it incredibly difficult for Trump to get any significant support for this outrageous attack. But most significantly, what we're seeing in Iran is the end, I think, of US military hegemony. During the unipolar era, the US was able to destroy countries, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, all countries that US was able to attack, cause massive damage, topple governments, and leave them in a complete mess. And in most instances, it was able to do this without suffering significant damage itself. They were so dominant that even the threat of attack would usually suffice. Trump thought he could do this to Iran as well. He was hoping that the destruction of the Iranian state would happen within a matter of days. But he's failed dramatically. Operation Epic Fury is looking increasingly like Operation Epic Fail. The US will not achieve its objectives, and the longer it persists with this war, the worse the outcome for the collective West will be, and the worse the outcome for the US will be. So what we see, I think, is that we're entering a new world order, a multipolar world order, one where US Western hegemony is no longer the uncontested power of the world. They have lost their political standing and moral authority. They've lost their economic domination, and they've lost their military invincibility. So we're transitioning from a unipolar world to a multipolar world, although what form that takes is still emerging. But one thing is clear, and that is that the countries of the global south will be leading this transition. Countries of the global south are not a homogenous bloc, but we can see in them, in all of them, attempts to build and maintain genuine alternatives to the current political and economic models that all have their origin in colonial domination and exploitation. Cuba is a key part of this. Alongside Palestinians and Iranians, Cubans are the heroes of the resistance. Palestine, Iran, and Cuba have defied US imperialism. They have given people hope and inspiration. Cuba has consistently stood with and supported people in struggle throughout the world, in South and Central America, in Southern Africa, particularly in the frontline states in the fight against apartheid, and in West Asia, notably with the Palestinians. The Cuban people have endured enormous suffering, but they have stood up against this aggression from the US and its allies, all while maintaining an extraordinary internationalist orientation. Right now, Cuba is in the crosshairs. After Trump's back down to Xi in Busan last year, the US released a national security doctrine where it emphasised that its main priority will be the domination and exploitation of the Western Hemisphere. Just a few weeks ago, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, again the photo that we saw before, delivered an extraordinary speech at the Munich Security Conference. In it, he praised European colonisation and called for a reassertion of European authority over the whole world. And Rubio is obsessed with destroying Cuba. The US is obsessed, and Rubio is particularly obsessed personally. For decades, Cuba has stood as an inspiration to progressive people all over the world. Now it's time for us to recognise that and to offer whatever solidarity and support that we can. The Trump administration is showing that as the US empire crumbles, it will act compulsively, irrationally, violently, unlawfully. It's time for the world to stand with Cuba. And for us here in Aotearoa, it's essential that we do whatever we can to make sure that New Zealand is not linked to this declining empire and instead stands for a new world based on peace, justice and freedom. Kia ora.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Small. It's a little-known fact that Rubio is an acronym for Rules-Based International Order. I think what you've shown is that rules-based order, which has been dictated or has been dictated by the United States, is an era which is coming to an end, and we can very soon, hopefully, all breathe a sigh of relief. Of course, there's a danger with that, because what comes next when you become desperate and you've got weapons of mass destruction like the United States has, and they're the most likely nation in the world to use them, as they've proven in the past, is the fear that they may an understanding of the collapse of the old empire and the rising of a better new empire that has more voices around the table, not permanent members of a Security Council which veto any opposition to imperial rule, takes hold. And I look forward to that, and you've given us hope that that can happen. So thank you. A round of applause. So far this evening, we have been richly blessed with a very talented range of speakers who have given us much to think about, and I'm sure there are many of you here sitting with questions. So we're going to take a wee 5-minute break. We're going to set up the front of the room with our great speakers who can respond to your questions. So think of some good ones if you haven't already, because I think while we've been very, very well spoken to so far this evening, there are still some gems, I think, that we can get from this great bunch of speakers. So give us 5 minutes. Without any further ado, who has a question or questions for any or all of our presenters? Sorry. I saw this hand over here.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a fairly basic and technical question, and that concerns the energy supplies to Cuba and what the actual status of possible or potential supplies. I mean, we hear kind of rumours or stories about either Mexico or some other countries are sending shipments of oil, but what's the actual reality that's either going to happen or planned? And there have been stories about even the Russians supplying oil as well. So, yeah, thank you.
Let me try to explain to you what is the real situation that we are facing nowadays. Cuba used to produce the 40% of oil that we consume with a very bad quality because has a very huge percent of sulfur that create many inconveniences to produce electricity. In the last 2 years, and with a finance from China, we increasing our production of electricity with different alternative sources, like solar one. Now we are producing almost 1,000 of megawatts by different alternative sources. and we continue trying to increase our production, our own production of oil, but it is still at about 40%. So in the following years, we should continue importing oil from abroad. And after the executive order of Trump last January 29, in which he said that he's going to increase tariff of all countries who decided to import oil to Cuba, we didn't receive any single tank of oil. I just explained before what happened in a country without oil. That's why today we are suffering most of the time 20, 30 hours of blackouts. And it is, and of course, people is unhappy because of this, because without electricity, it's not possible to conserve food or anything. So we are living in very difficult times. There are many countries, friendly countries, who said that they are going to support Cuba. But in fact, in the last 3 years, in the last 3 months, we didn't receive any single tank of oil. This is the real fact. And we are trying to continue increasing the production of energy, taking care different alternative sources. Try to reduce the importation of oil, but it takes time. It is not possible to achieve the objective in a short period of time, because before COVID, we used to receive 5 million of visitors in Cuba every year. After COVID, we are receiving less than 2 million. So we don't have the same resources than in the past to have access to this technology that is very expensive. And why we reduce tourism? Because, for example, since Trump decided to remove ESTA visa to everyone in Europe, New Zealand, Australia who decided to go to Cuba. So people from Europe can go to the United States without requesting visa. But if you decided to go to Cuba first, you should request permission to go to the United States, and they have the right to say yes or no. So now people think twice to go to Cuba for holiday or for every reason. It is still, there are many direct flights from Europe, like from Paris, from Madrid, from Rome, but people think twice now to go to Cuba for holiday, because they are going to, they can remove their access to United States without requesting visa. So that's why we try to improve our main industry, that is tourism, but at the same time, we are fighting against all those decisions from the US administration. Now we decided not to continue stamp visa in any passport. The process now is very simple, because people should fill out a form digitally and send it to us, and we give them electronic visa without stamping in their passport. But anyway, you know that now to have access to the United States, they said that they are going to check even the social media of everyone who decided to visit the United States. So it's very difficult to avoid or not to be sure that people visited Cuba, because there are many ways in which they can know that, even without stamping visa in their passport. This is the real fact that we are facing nowadays. Let's see what happens in the following days. Trump said that he's thinking to in a friendly takeover of Cuba. I don't know what does that mean. I don't know what does that mean to take a friendly takeover of Cuba, because we are able to sit on the table to discuss with them every issue. But as I told you before, there are many preconditions, and the most important one is to preserve our sovereignty. So I think that this is the question.
Yeah, so during USA's kind of intensification of its attacks on Venezuela, it deployed 1/7 of its naval fleet in the Caribbean region. And in December, there was one ship with oil from Venezuela. This is before Maduro's kidnapping, on the way to Cuba, and it got basically hijacked, stolen. And when Trump was asked, this is Cuba's oil, right? Trump was asked, what would you do with it? We'd probably keep it. And then there was a Russian tanker, you're right, that was coming down. But then this naval presence, 1/7 of US naval fleets, they were able to divert it away. There was also one Russian tanker that was basically chased out. I don't know if you remember this, by the US naval forces. So they're asserting their dominance in that region, which is blocking any friendly nations from being able to support Cuba. And also with tariffs as well. So Mexico is being threatened with tariffs and many other things, destabilization, right? A lot of those Mexican gangs that were causing violence, they had been armed and trained with connections to the United States. So United States is currently in a phase of hyper-imperialism in the Latin American region. And the biggest stuff, I think the other day I was hearing Cuban pediatric doctors talking about the cancer wards and how they need power. And because, the electricity grid is still dependent on oil, the hospitals aren't getting power. And the Cuban children with cancer, their survival rates is declining because of this. So this is a wholesale effort to dismantle Cuba's achievements. Mm.
Yes, thank you. And that reminds me when you said, Luis, so last year my wife was offered a free trip to the United States and she rejected it. So I'm not interested in going, but she'd be open to one from Cuba, I'm sure. We have another question over here.
A brief anecdote to illustrate the question. I was in Cuba some 40 years ago, and I had a young interrupter, we call them, interpreter. She was a diminutive young woman of about 20. And an Irish woman in our group asked her how she participated in the Cuban society. So she explained gently, well, she was in the Cuban Women's Federation, and their leaders were part of the senior party apparatus, and she was in her trade union, and likewise. And she was asked, do you want to, when you graduate from the university, join the Communist Party? She said, well, it's not up to me. I have to be elected in it. You don't just join a party, you have to be elected in it. Oh, and the next question was, well, okay, and how else do you participate? Oh, she said, I'm in the militia. There was a gasp. What? You mean with guns and things? Yes, I shoot. I'm not very good, but I am mentally prepared. Now, my question is, that was the morale 40 years ago. With the post-revolutionary generation, where the memory of their parents of pre-revolutionary times and all that the revolution had done, she had said, we were the brothel of the Americas. We had no schools, we had no hospitals, and now I'm educated and I'm healthy and I have employment, etc., etc. She's now 50-odd. Were her children, or are her children, similarly staunch in support of the revolution, or has, with the passing generations, that affection and affiliation and staunchness declined? Do you think?
Well, if you don't mind, in order to feel free and to answer much better, I'm going to answer in Spanish, and my friend here is going to help me to translate into English. A ver, yo tengo 51 años.
I'm 51 years old.
Y junto conmigo hay una generación de cubanos que nacieron ya bajo los efectos del bloqueo norteamericano a Cuba.
And together with me, there's a lot of Cubans and a generation of Cubans that were born under this blockade in the United States.
Es decir, todo el que nació después de 1960 ha sido sometido directa o indirectamente o ha sido afectado por las sanciones del bloqueo norteamericano.
That means that after 1960s, everybody has been affected and has been subject of the blockade from the United States.
Y no es menos cierto que no conocieron las bondades o no conocimos, es decir, los que tuvimos la oportunidad de vivir en los 70, 80, conocimos las bondades del socialismo cubano.
And there was that were lucky enough that to experience all of the benefits from the socialism in Cuba from the 70s and 80s.
Pero los que nacieron después de 1990, 1991,
But the ones that were born after the 90s, until 1991,
han tenido que sobrevivir a las carencias, las necesidades, las vicisitudes,
they have to survive the scarcity on all of the hardships that we have to face.
Por eso es que se hace tan difícil el trabajo político ideológico con los jóvenes.
That's why it's so hard to work on this ideologically with the youth.
Porque es convencerlos de algo que no han tenido la oportunidad de vivir y de experimentar personalmente.
Because it's trying to convince them to go through and live and experience something they haven't had a chance to experience.
Pero al mismo tiempo, los niños, los jóvenes en Cuba, desde muy temprana edad, comienzan a participar directa o indirectamente a través de las organizaciones que los representan en la sociedad cubana.
But from a very young age, kids start participating in different organizations that help them being represented as well.
Y van concientizando no solo la situación de Cuba, sino lo que pasa hoy en el mundo.
And also, it raise awareness of not only what happens in Cuba, but also what happens around the world.
Y aquí Josephine hablaba de las elecciones en Cuba. Realmente es verdad que en Cuba no existe el multipartidismo, existe el Partido Comunista de Cuba.
And Josephine was mentioning that before about the parties in Cuba, that there's no multipolar parties, right? It's just the Party of Cuba.
Pero el partido en Cuba no nomina y no elige.
But the party in Cuba does not nominate and does not choose.
Acorde a nuestro sistema electoral, el partido no interviene ni participa en el proceso electoral.
And based on our system, the party does not really intervene in the electoral system.
Sin embargo, producto de ese sistema que tenemos en Cuba y que hemos aceptado aprobar en nuestra Constitución, hoy el presidente de la Federación de Estudiantes Universitarios, por solo citar un ejemplo, es miembro del Consejo de Estado.
And because of that system now, we have, for example, just to give you an example, the union, the Federation of Students, the president of the Federation of Students is right now part of this system too, that's working for the state.
Not only to the system, but he's member of the Council of the States. I mean, he's member of in our National Assembly, there are plenty of youth people participating with their opinion and in the discussion about the most important issues for our society. So the implication or the participation of since the very early stage of people in Cuba in the main decisions of the country in different ways create a huge commitment with the country. So en ese sentido, yo creo que en Cuba sigue existiendo un compromiso hay un fuerte sentimiento de independencia y de soberanía del país.
Mm-hmm. And that's why, because of that, and in that regard, in Cuba continues to pursue this feeling of sovereignty in the country and of commitment in the country.
Estamos hablando de los jóvenes. Cuba es el tercer, cuarto país con más representación femenina en su parlamento.
We're talking about the youth. Cuba is the third or fourth country with the highest representation of women in the parliament.
Es decir, cuando usted examina, evalúa cada segmento de la sociedad nuestra, tienen una participación real en las principales decisiones que atañen al país.
And when you analyze the real implications of this, they do have a real participation of the decisions that are made for the country.
Al mismo tiempo, enfrentamos el desafío de jóvenes que no hemos logrado convencer y que hoy se pliegan a las campañas mediáticas que, por ejemplo, se orquestan todos los días en Miami, en Florida, contra Cuba.
And at the same time, we have part of the youth that we haven't been able to convince yet. And they end up being seduced by these campaigns, these mass campaigns that happen in Miami, in Florida.
Por eso se dan hechos como el que ocurrió hace 2 o 3 días en Cuba, en que en un horario nocturno y después de 30 horas sin energía eléctrica, quemaron varias cosas, es decir, no instalaciones, pero sí en la calle, quemaron muebles y equipos de determinadas oficinas públicas del gobierno.
And that's why issues like the one that happened the other day, for example, that after 30 hours of outage, people started to set things on fire, not literally buildings, but they started to grab things from buildings and started to set it on fire on the street.
Sí, hay un nivel de cansancio, hay un nivel de agotamiento, no solo en la juventud, sino en la sociedad cubana.
So there's a level of tiredness, of exhaustion, not only just people, but also the society, the Cuban society.
Es muy difícil, por más resiliente que sea el pueblo cubano, someterse a el estado actual de las sanciones norteamericanas, que se han recrudecido mucho más con el gobierno de Trump.
So that's why it's very hard as a people from Cuba to withstand and also to try to survive and go through the sanctions that the American government is putting upon us.
En pocas palabras, podría responderle como que es un gran desafío el que tenemos hoy con los más jóvenes en Cuba.
In a nutshell, I could just say that it's a big challenge that we have ahead of us with the youth in Cuba.
Pero hay un liderazgo
But it's definitely a leadership.
Dentro de los jóvenes que estamos seguros le darán continuidad a la obra de la revolución.
That we are very certain that they will continue the revolution. Thank you.
In 1981, we had the Springbok Tour, where White South Africa, its national sports team, toured New Zealand, and people turned out to protest that and to oppose it. And key members of the ANC leadership who were in prison at the time said getting reports from New Zealand that this sort of solidarity was happening greatly lifted them psychologically, both on an individual level, but even within the spirit of the party and the resistance itself. What can we do in New Zealand in a similar kind of way that could support Cubans and help improve morale by showing their solidarity with them internationally?
Y apoyar a Cuba en este momento.
Les voy a ser totalmente franco y sincero.
I'm going to be totally honest.
Este evento de hoy que ustedes han organizado, puedo asegurarles que en mi experiencia después de 2 años en Nueva Zelanda, es la mejor forma de concientizar a la sociedad neozelandesa en su conjunto de la importancia de la solidaridad hacia Cuba como país que resiste y se enfrenta a las políticas norteamericanas hoy en día.
I'm going to be totally honest. And I've been here for 2 years already, and this kind of events where they raise awareness of the situation in Cuba is one of the best ways that you can help Cuba and support, in this case, and raise the morale for us because of all of the situation that is happening right now in the United States.
He participado en eventos como este, en Wellington, en Auckland, pero la profundidad, el análisis que ha tenido hoy este evento realmente no es el que comúnmente suele estar presente en los eventos de solidaridad con Cuba.
So I've been in Wellington, in Auckland, an event like this, but it is not very common to find the level of depth in which people like you are analyzing the situation and the way of showing solidarity to the people of Cuba as well is.
A la vez que le quiero agradecer a los colegas que me han acompañado en el panel, quiero trasladarles también a ustedes un agradecimiento porque este evento de hoy nos permite replicar esta experiencia con ese mismo nivel que ha tenido este evento en otras ciudades cuando los amigos de la solidaridad se reúnen a expresar sus sentimientos hacia Cuba.
And also, apart from saying thank you to my colleagues present here with me, I wanted to say thank you for being present here today, because this helps spread solidarity when we go to other events around to express solidarity with Cuba.
De hecho, Josephine me va a acompañar el próximo 27 de marzo a Oakland para tener un encuentro con la Asociación de Amistad en esa ciudad.
Actually, Josephine is going to go with me on the 27th to Oakland to go to the Association of Friendship that is present there.
Y yo espero que en el futuro Jan y el estimado profesor también puedan trasladar su experiencia a otros públicos que no sean solo el de Nueva Zelanda, el de Christchurch.
And I hope that in the future, Ian and also the estimate professor, David, are able to go with me and just go to other places that not only New Zealand but abroad as well.
A veces es mucho más efectivo escuchar el testimonio de neozelandeses que tienen esos extraordinarios sentimientos de gratitud y de solidaridad con Cuba que a mí propiamente. Es decir, yo creo que es más efectivo el mensaje que a veces ellos trasladan que el que puedo trasladar yo como embajador.
Sometimes listening to people that are New Zealanders trying to share this solidarity and bringing this message of solidarity, for me sometimes more solidarity and gratitude, sometimes it's even more important than even listening to myself as a Cuban.
Yo estoy sorprendido. En Oakland siempre ha existido una asociación de amistad que ha mantenido un trabajo sistemático de solidaridad con Cuba.
Yeah, I'm surprised because in Auckland, for example, there's always been this union of solidarity, friendship union, that is showing this solidarity and support for Cuba.
Pero nunca había visto levantarse un movimiento tan amplio y diverso como el que hoy se levanta en Wellington y en Christchurch.
But I've never seen a movement that is being brought upon us now, in this case, like the one that is present here in Christchurch and in Wellington.
El próximo 21 de marzo llega a Cuba o va a tener lugar una iniciativa que le han llamado Convoy a Cuba y lidera la activista sueca Greta
Thunberg. 21 de marzo.
21.
So the 21st of March, there's an activity that is happening very soon as well, where Greta Thunberg is going to be present there as well, where we'll be discussing this.
Una buena parte de la intelectualidad latinoamericana, europea, ya está en Cuba y otra parte está llegando para participar en ese evento de solidaridad con Cuba, donde se va a hacer la entrega de donativos que han estado llegando al país en este periodo por barco, por vía aérea, marítima, etc.
So, esto pasa en Cuba, ¿no? Sí. Okay. So in Cuba, this event will bring the knowledge and intellectual knowledge, not only present, the one in Cuba, but also from all the different parts of the world, and the aid by ocean, by air, that will be arriving to Cuba as well during that day.
Incluso están llevando una importante carga de sistemas fotovoltaicos, paneles solares, para tratar de apoyar en la estrategia del país para revertir la situación energética en estos momentos.
They're also bringing loads of solar panels and electric grids to help people and revert the current situation that the country is going through.
La última exposición de arte cubano que se presentó en Oakland, se subastaron obras que allí se presentaron, que proporcionó la embajada nuestra. Y con el dinero que se recaudó, se apoyó una campaña para comprar catéteres, para hacer operaciones del corazón en Cuba que no se han podido hacer porque precisamente no nos permiten comprar esos insumos en Estados Unidos.
So the latest campaign that was done was in Auckland, where the art made by Cubans was an auction of all of the artwork, and all of the money that got in the end of that presentation and of the exhibition, they ended up buying catheters for Cuba so they can finally perform their operations and the cardiac surgery that were heavily needed, and because we cannot really buy it directly from the States.
So hay muchas formas e iniciativas que se pueden tener y nosotros, por supuesto, siempre lo agradeceremos como muestra de solidaridad con Cuba.
So as you can see, there are many different ways in which you can support Cuba, and we will always appreciate the solidarity that you are showing towards us.
Pero si puedo expresarlo desde mi punto de vista, yo hoy considero que más que la ayuda material que hace falta, es más importante tener el acompañamiento de los amigos de la solidaridad acá, apoyando nuestra causa y defendiendo nuestro derecho a seguir existiendo como nación soberana.
But beyond the material help that you may try to help us with, I think that the moral support and the solidarity that you are showing from the friends, of course, of the Society of Friends that is trying to support us now, that is the most important thing that will help us continue to thrive as a sovereign nation.
I just wanted to add one thing, is that it's also what David mentioned, is if we are able to weaken the US empire in whatever way we can, that is going to be beneficial for not only Cuba, but the whole world. And the way to do that is to actually have a sovereign foreign policy for New Zealand. Basically throwing the FBI out of New Zealand and getting out of the Five Eyes. And I'm seeing that this position is becoming more and more mainstream. Some political parties are raising this as a position that we need to get out of the Five Eyes. And like we have mentioned, the global imperial system is like a necklace of beads across the world. And the nations in the imperial core, like New Zealand, are quite important in this network. So if we can cut ourselves out of that necklace of imperialism, then that is a blow to the empire. This is what Che said, right? We need 2, 3, many Vietnams. Wherever we can harm the imperial system, that is going to benefit the liberation of humanity everywhere.
Might also just add that when the imperialists engage in some outrageous form of attack or exploitation or whatever, and people oppose it, we need to be careful what we say about that. There was widespread condemnation of the genocide in Gaza, and rightly so. But one of the things that disturbed me is how many people prefaced their opposition to genocide by, I hate Hamas, I hate Hezbollah, but we can't do this. People like Piers Morgan wouldn't let anybody say anything unless they started off by condemning Hamas.
Right.
We are seeing it now in relation to Iran, that even people who are opposing this attack on Iran are prefacing their comments with what an evil regime Iran is. We saw it in relation to Venezuela. People who oppose the kidnap of Maduro preface their comments with what an evil person Maduro was and what an evil regime the Venezuelan government was. And we see it in Cuba, and as they intensify their opposition to Cuba, we will be also hearing stories demonizing Cuba. So I think and one of the difficulties of just allowing this to go, we can see it in the Iran war at the moment, that you have people who go, well, not only is Iran a terrible government, but they've been supporting terrorism. How's that? They've been supporting Hamas and Hezbollah. And we've already bought into this. Hamas and Hezbollah are evil people, and so this is an argument against them. So we need to be really careful about not playing into that sort of game, not playing into that demonization of governments that are having the courage to stand up and defy the forces of imperialism.
Let me add just one more thing. You asked about how many ways you can contribute to your solidarity towards Cuba. In fact, New Zealand used to vote in favor of the Cuban resolution. I mean, we used to present a resolution in the General Assembly of UN every year requesting to put an end to the sanctions towards Cuba. New Zealand used to vote in favor of our resolution. So they express their disagree with this kind of measures against not only Cuba, but also third countries. But at the same time, it's very difficult to concrete practical action. In the past, during 30, 20 years, we used to import powdered milk from here. We had an agreement with Fonterra, and we used to import tons of powdered milk from here. But in the last year, we should pay 50% in advance. So we try to change our approach to that kind of things. And we said we are more interested to increase the production of milk in Cuba instead of continue importing from abroad. So in that sense, we talked to the Ministry of Primary Industry, we talked to MFAT, we talked to everyone, because we realize about the achievement of New Zealand in livestock and agriculture sector. And for example, New Zealand has a program that they call Smart Agricultural Program for Latin America. The main objective of that program is to reduce the green gas emission in our region. And we try to be part of this. And we explain to them many times. But I realize that it's very difficult to concrete practical actions in cooperation, in trade, So one of the most important things is when people from New Zealand write to MPs of your constituencies, because it creates certain consciousness in Parliament, and sometimes I went to Parliament many times, and I met with many MPs from Labour, from Green Party, even from the national one. But I think it is important that not only the embassy, we need to receive the accompany of our friends here in New Zealand, requesting to the MPs the possibility to have a real discussion in Parliament about the support of New Zealand to Cuba. So this is another way that I think that you can use it to push them to be more active towards the solidarity with Cuba.
I'm just interested to know when that support for Cuba stopped and the support of the blockade at the UN. Can you answer that?
We presented that kind of resolution since 1992, and we received the support of New Zealand since that time. I mean, New Zealand continue voting in favor of the Cuban resolution, requesting to put an end that kind of sanctions.
So that support hasn't stopped?
Yes.
Okay, good.
But to translate that New Zealand position into practical policies or measures in favor of Cuba, it's more difficult. And I realized that when people here write a letter to any MP, they used to answer them in different ways. But it is important to continue having this kind of.
Cool. Yes.
Just before I start my question, I'd like to give a greeting to our hosts, whose house is at Tuahiwi, and of course to our hosts here more imminently, the Council of Trade Unions local here. And thanks to all of you speakers very much. So I guess my question leads from this, that I think that at one time Cuba, I know this from Castro's biography, Cuba was ready to be the first to die in a nuclear exchange that would have ushered in, or in Castro's words anyway, perhaps destroyed America and ushered in some kind of new world. It doesn't sound good, but that was the courage that the Cubans showed, I think, in standing up to America, even if it meant death for all of them on behalf of the world. That's like being a revolutionary. That's like going to the fight, right? Now today, I would say the rules-based international order is gone, is dead. The choice of negotiation has been taken away from us. So I guess my challenge or question is, and I think this question more falls at the feet of my fellow workers here in this room and more at the feet of our representatives here who go to Parliament for us or go to the bargaining table for us, but you guys will have the privilege of answering it, is how long will we cling to this hope of negotiation, this hope of peace, of a world that was perhaps, maybe at one time possible, but is no longer? How long will we allow those who rule over us to pick off our friends one by one while we come running every time they propose a dialogue? And how long until we return to a time where we believe that the revolution makes forward progress when we take the fight to our enemies?
I'm not going to answer that question. I'm going to try to. Look, in fact, it was actually at Canterbury University. I did a course on a book by E.P. Thompson called The Making of the English Working Class. And its large focus was on the rise of the working class that, among other things, led to the extension of the male suffrage, at least, from the 1810s, 20s, and sort of culminating much more in the 1930s when it was really right. And the basic thesis was that is struggle, and struggle goes in different forms. Every time this is my weakest attack on the capitalist system, but I still do it because I don't like the banks, is that when I go to use my FPOS card to pay for something and the surcharge appears, I deliberately make the point of doing it to avoid the surcharge. That at the very lowest level makes me think that I'm struggling a little bit, even if it makes no difference. It might just feel a little bit better. But I think, you take that further, and consciousness is uneven, and it ebbs and flows. And as long as the struggle continues, and it's variety of forms, you actually get somewhere in the right direction. And there are setbacks. Bill Anderson, a prominent union leader in the past, quite a long time ago, was always saying that sometimes you have to accept a bit of a defeat in order to be able to fight. You might lose a battle, but you still struggle for the war. And I think that's an approach that, I think that's a large chunk of what is probably going on in Venezuela at the moment. I don't know enough about it, but I have a sense that that's the sort of things that they are having to consider now, some battles that they're just not going to win, but maintaining as enough strength as possible to bounce back and go on. Mm-hmm. Cuba will have the same challenges in a different way. And the dynamics of Cuba are different from the dynamics of Venezuela. But the struggle is important because the struggle gives consciousness. It's all about, if you like, what Marx said and what Trotsky said and others. It's about uneven and combined development.
Tampoco pretendo responder tu pregunta.
I do not intend to answer your question either.
pero voy a tratar de aportar algo para tratar de contextualizarlo.
But I'm going to try to contribute somehow to contextualize it.
Es verdad que estamos viendo un papel disminuido de la Asamblea General de Naciones Unidas y del Consejo de Seguridad.
It is true that we are seeing a diminished role when it comes to the General Assembly of the United Nations and the Security Council.
En contraposición a una agresividad creciente del gobierno norteamericano, no solo hacia Cuba, sino hacia el mundo. Y hoy hay muchos ejemplos que se pudieran presentar acá.
Of course, against there's massive oppression that we're receiving by the American government, not only to Cuba, but also the rest of the world. There are many examples that we can start telling right now.
Groenlandia, para no hablar de Irán, Groenlandia, los conflictos que están habiendo dentro de la propia OTAN.
Greenland and all of the other conflicts as well that is happening with OTAN as well.
Pero también es cierto, y ustedes saben, que Estados Unidos está abocado a unas elecciones de medio término el próximo mes de noviembre.
But it's also true that the elections are coming for the United States, in the midterm elections at least, in November.
Y eso obliga a Trump a tener algún resultado que exhibir en política exterior.
And that demands Trump to show certain results, at least when it comes to foreign policies.
Es cierto que el suceso de Venezuela los inspiró, los mantiene, los hizo creerse que podían replicar esa experiencia, quizás en Irán primero, en Cuba luego, pero la verdad es que están atascados en estos momentos en Irán.
And the apparent success they had in Venezuela inspired them to keep going, with this and maybe with Iran, but then with other countries, but then they realized that they're stuck right now with Iran.
En cualquier variante, el resultado de lo que pasa en Irán es desfavorable para Cuba.
No matter what the outcome is with Iran, it will not be favorable for Cuba.
Si se extiende el conflicto en Irán, en el cual ya empiezan a tener cada vez más bajas, más pérdidas y más gastos,
If the conflict gets extended when they start spending more money, they have more soldiers, of course, being killed, and they have more expenses.
van a querer tener una victoria política antes de noviembre y Cuba está dentro de las posibilidades más cercanas que ellos contemplan.
Well, the elections will be in November, and one of the potential possibilities that are continuing would be Cuba, would be one of the ones that they are considering at the moment.
Y si realmente pudieran ganar el conflicto en Irán, van a sentirse doblemente entusiasmados después de Venezuela e Irán para ir por Cuba.
And if they win the situation right now with Iran, they will feel even more encouraged to continue, and even greatly more encouraged now to continue with Cuba as well next.
Entonces, ustedes saben y son conscientes de cuántos problemas internos hay dentro de la propia sociedad norteamericana.
And you already know, you're quite well aware of all the present conflicts and problems that are present in the United States and the society in the United States at the moment.
Todas las elecciones locales que se han hecho para las elecciones locales que se han realizado en Estados Unidos, incluso en los feudos republicanos históricos, han ganado los demócratas.
In all of the local elections that you have seen, even where the normal Republican feuds, right, end up winning, the Democrats are winning at the moment.
Y aunque el movimiento MAGA sigue teniendo un número no despreciable de personas que siguen apoyando la agenda de Trump, no es menos cierto que se puede pensar en una debacle de los republicanos en las próximas elecciones de medio término.
And even if the Omara movement continues to stay strong, this of course shows that it is very possible that the defeat of the Republicans is coming now in the November elections.
Por lo tanto, al menos en el caso de Cuba particularmente, tenemos que tratar por todos los medios de evitar una confrontación a mayor escala o militar antes que se produzcan esas elecciones de medio término en Estados Unidos, lo cual es un escenario probable.
That's why we have to, as Cubans, to avoid, by all means, an escalation, a military escalation or confrontation with the American government at the moment before the elections happen in November.
Ciertamente Estados Unidos es la mayor potencia militar hoy, quizás seguida por China, por lo cual tiene la capacidad de militarmente invadir el país nuestro si lo quisiera.
We have to be honest and recognize as well that the United States is the biggest military power at the moment, probably followed by China. So if they wanted to invade us, they could.
El problema es que para ocupar el país tienen que, no lo pueden hacer desde el aire, tienen que enviar tropas. Y ahí es donde empieza el principal conflicto.
And the detail is that they cannot just do it through air, right? So if they want to do it, they have to do it and send some troops by the ocean, by sea. And that's where the conflict starts.
Y esa sociedad no está lista para recibir muchos ataúdes, sí, soldados norteamericanos muertos, que es lo que ocurriría en un número no despreciable si intentan invadir Cuba.
And that society is not ready to receive coffins from American soldiers. That's what would happen if they decide to take over.
Es decir, el tema Cuba no se puede ver aislado, hay que verlo en el contexto de lo que está pasando en el mundo hoy.
So we cannot really see Cuba as an isolated problem. We need to see it within the context that is happening around the world.
Hay muchas variables que intervienen en una eventual toma de decisión en relación a Cuba.
There are many different aspects to consider when making decisions when it comes to Cuba.
Y el profesor lo planteaba y yo estoy de acuerdo. Hoy está cambiando la geopolítica en el mundo. Y nuevos actores políticos están surgiendo. Los BRICS, la Asociación de Estados del Sudeste Asiático, la ASEAN, y que están jugando cada vez un papel más preponderante en la política internacional.
And I totally agree with what the professor mentioned earlier. The geopolitics is changing. So now we have other actors playing those roles, right? So we have BRICS, we have the ASEAN, right? That is, of course, the Asian region as well. We have many different actors that are changing the way we are working with the world, we see in the world at the moment.
Tu pregunta daría para estar hablando no solo yo, sino todos los que estamos aquí, mucho más tiempo.
Well, your question would probably have us all speaking here for a few hours, not only me, but all of us here in this panel.
Roll on November for the US and for New Zealand. That would be great to see some change, yeah. Are there any other questions?
Yes, a question that's off center a bit. Religious organizations have often given a very weak morally backbone to imperialistic powers. How should countries that have religious organizations that are weak in their moral beliefs, how should we as a New Zealand society, or how did Cuba as a Catholic society handle that?
Históricamente Cuba ha tenido excelentes relaciones, no solo con la Iglesia Católica, sino con todas las denominaciones religiosas que coexisten en el país.
So historically, Cuba has had great relations with not only with the Catholic religion, but also with other religions that coexist in the country.
Y esas organizaciones religiosas en Cuba mantienen con sus homólogas de Estados Unidos y de muchas otras partes del mundo excelentes relaciones.
And those homologues as well keep the same relations as well, not only with the United States, but also with other countries around the world.
Este año precisamente estamos celebrando el 91 aniversario del establecimiento de las relaciones diplomáticas con el Vaticano.
So this year we are celebrating the 91st anniversary with our relations with the Vatican.
Y hablando precisamente de las excelentes relaciones que mantenemos con la Iglesia Católica y con las demás denominaciones, me viene a la mente ahora un hecho que ocurrió hace 2 semanas.
And now, speaking of the same good relations that we have with the Catholic Church, for example, and other organizations, I just remember something that happened the other week.
El encargado de negocio de Estados Unidos en La Habana viajó a Roma para primero persuadir a los embajadores de los diferentes países que están acreditados ante el Vaticano y luego a las autoridades de la Santa Sede para tratar de interferir en esas relaciones que mantiene la Iglesia Católica con Cuba.
So the business representative that went to the Vatican. Oh, the Church of Affairs. All right. So the Church of Affairs went to directly to the Vatican, trying to convince the other leaders that were present there as well to, of course, stop having this relationship with Cuba that we've had.
The U.S. Church of Affairs in Havana traveled to Rome to convince the authorities of the Vatican try to create conflicts in our bilateral relation between the Vatican and the government of Cuba. That I told you before that we are celebrating 91 years of the establishing diplomatic relationship. Just for you to know how U.S. tried to do its best to create problems, even in our relation, not only with governments, but also with different organizaciones religiosas.
Religious organizations.
Religious organizations all around the world. But, y entonces están tratando de utilizar a la Iglesia Católica en Cuba para hacer llegar una supuesta ayuda a Cuba.
So they're trying to use the Catholic Church in Cuba to try to supposedly bring some aid to Cuba.
Por ejemplo, el año pasado sufrimos las consecuencias de un gran huracán que devastó el oriente del país.
So last year, for example, we suffered the consequences of a massive hurricane that devastated the west part of the country.
Cuba tiene una larga experiencia en recibir donaciones, apoyos, ayudas y en canalizarlas de manera efectiva y comprobada por los organismos de Naciones Unidas a la población. Sin embargo, ellos dicen que no confían en el gobierno cubano y por eso usan a la Iglesia Católica para que intervenga en esos procesos.
We have a long history of receiving aid from many different countries, and we have organizations that are making sure that everything is being done and is being, of course, recorded properly by our organizations. But now they're using the church to show a way of saying, no, sorry, we do not really trust in your institutions. So we're going to send the church now to make sure that you guys are doing the right thing.
Es decir, el gobierno cubano mantiene un intercambio frecuente, sistemático, con las organizaciones religiosas todas que existen en Cuba. Pero al mismo tiempo, esas organizaciones tratan de ser interferidas o utilizadas con el doble propósito de enfrentarlas al gobierno cubano.
Yeah, we've been working directly with the churches as well, the different religious organizations, and we have no problem. But at the same time, they're being used to try to persuade and interfere in how this hate, for example, is being received with the government and the Cuban government at the moment. So.
Cuba tuvo el privilegio de recibir a los últimos 3 papas en La Habana.
Cuba had the privilege of receiving the last 3 popes in Havana.
Karol Wojtyła, Benedicto,
Pope Benedict,
y Francisco.
And Francis.
En 2 ocasiones.
Twice.
Porque el encuentro que tuvo Francisco con el patriarca de la Iglesia Ortodoxa Rusa fue en La Habana.
Because the encounter that Pope Francis had with the Orthodox Church, the Patriarch of the Orthodox Church was in Havana.
Es decir, Cuba tiene el privilegio que ningún otro país latinoamericano ha tenido de recibir la visita de los 3 últimos papas.
So Cuba's got the privilege that no other country has in Latin America that is receiving the 3 last popes.
Y el Papa actual recibió al canciller nuestro, al ministro de Relaciones Exteriores, hace una semana.
And the current Pope received the Foreign Affairs Minister just a week ago.
Y la Iglesia Católica, al igual que lo hizo en el periodo Obama, está tratando de servir como puente para una eventual negociación con los Estados Unidos.
And, now the church as well is trying to be used as a bridge with a potential negotiation with the United States.
Es decir, que está en el mejor ánimo de la Iglesia tratar de lograr un entendimiento entre los 2 países.
So they're trying to do the best they can in order to support both countries and interests of both countries.
Thank you.
Is it time? Okay. looks like we may need to wrap it up there then. Thank you everybody for your attendance this evening. It's been wonderful and your questions have been great too, and the answers as well. I think we can all admit that we've learnt a lot. I know I have, about what an example Cuba can be for New Zealand. And if we don't buy into the international order dictated by the United States, then we could actually do things in this country that would be in the interests of our people, like you have in Cuba. And so I'm very grateful for what you've shared with us tonight. For all of our speakers here tonight, a big round of applause. It amounts to nothing less than economic genocide that the United States is perpetrating on Cuba, and in whatever ways we can help to bring solidarity, to raise awareness, to offer support, either through resources or through moral support, I encourage everybody here to do so, and I know that it will be gratefully received, and it makes a difference, and that support matters. We may think that we're small and what we contribute is little, but every bit counts and it makes a difference. And so I encourage each and every one of us, I'm speaking to myself as well, to make the effort to do that so that we become part of the change, not part of the status quo. And thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you. Very nice to meet you.
Thank you very much.
It's wonderful.